Ah, traditional in Minden video, pretty much. Yes, just one of those. Another one of those. Talking to a couple of people, reacting to the things they say. This camera will actually stay here. Who knows? Probably should turn that off. Yeah, maybe I'll turn this off. See, well, I'll tone it down. How's that? No, that's probably not good. So I won't do that. Anyway, doesn't matter. Probably doesn't matter. See, that was traditional. It was some sort of get on the tracks and okay, start, pushing the whatever it is, the train wreck into the wrecking position. Alright, so Anaconda and Puro and this word skepticism and this whole communicating with people and establishing premises and where all this goes incredibly wrong and why it's just so hard to have a conversation with human beings. And who insults whose intelligence first and all of that crap, which I really don't want to get into. But it obviously happens, and this just becomes some sort of you're an asshole. It's where it just ends up. Fuck you. And this shouldn't have to go there, but I mean, there's a certain obstinateness about it, like the Holiday thing. Like you go over 3 stupid ideas, and you just keep going over them over. You get one settled, and you get some agreement, and then you have to argue the ones that were supposed to be settled. And then by the time you settle those, that first one's now unsettled again. And it's just this routine of bullshit. Circular argumentation, infinitum. And it's just, so I'm just going to, and so this critique is that, it's just going to be another critique of the fact that you guys are cheating. Okay, you're cheating. There's no, I'm not cheating. I'm sincerely saying, look, let's find the truth. Do you have a good argument for your truth? And I don't think they have it. They're just explaining why they don't have to have an argument. That's in Anaconda's case is, no, I'm just saying I don't have to accept anything. Any parameters until I say it's a parameter. I'll accept the parameter cheese tastes good, and I'll accept the parameter that I don't want to have all the bones in my body broken tomorrow. It's probably going to be inconvenient, and I don't unpleasant, and it doesn't sound like much fun. So I think I'll take a pass on that. If you're offering it with a coupon and a rebate, I still don't think I'll buy it, even if it's really cheap. He'll accept those as conditional truths or some kind of bullshit like that. And it's like, well, what's the point, right? I mean, I'm arguing that, look, there's this premise to existence, this evolution thing. You don't buy it, okay, fine. Then let's just say you're a theist or you're something else. But what's the point? And if you accept the evolution thing, you have to accept, it comes with a lot of unflattering facts about what we are as just need machines, as consumption machines, and how we have a psychology that wasn't going back to he loves book references. Well, I'll give you a movie reference. I guess it was a book, The African Queen, and the nature is something we're here to overcome, Mr. Walnut. Walnut, whatever, walnut. The whole point is saying that, oh yes, the crude system knows what the truth is and knows what's valuable, and us as the sophisticated system, we're supposed to pretend that because we have an imagination, we can't tell the truth from the imaginated part, the made up shit, the wishful thinking, or the that creates an escape route for me. I'll just pretend it's not, reality isn't real, and I'll just pretend there's some catch-22. Well, reality isn't real, so yep, you're not going to go to jail because there's no reality, and so no point in locking people up in a non-reality. It just doesn't go anywhere, and so yeah, so at least Puro appropriately diagnoses this as a perversion of skepticism because it can't be open-ended. But Anaconda will keep claiming he doesn't have open-ended skepticism, but of course he does. His skepticism is so conditional to what he likes or dislikes about a truth. So if it's a truth he likes, let's kill the commies. Let's fondle Donald Trump's, lovely ball sack, because he's just a wonderful capitalist who inherited it. He didn't earn a goddamn thing. But, I'm not saying he's a supporter, but I'm just saying that's his general philosophy is just so, he's certainly capable of recognizing the black and white between the fascists and the communists, and he'll tend to like the, capitalist fascists, and hate the socialist commies. But anyway, I really don't want to make this a political argument, because, well, frankly, I think he's got less chance of surviving with any kind of intellectual integrity in an argument about his myopic perception of what the definition of civilization should be. But anyway, side issue. So yeah, I want to kind of get to the Pyrrho thing, not the Anaconda thing. So I'll try to sum up here in that, I'm still going to make the accusation that Anaconda is just cheating. Okay, this idea that the idea of it, he uses an example that it's all conditional, it's all this and it's all that, and he uses this simple example of, well, the people in the north think it gets warmer as you go south, and the people in the south think it gets warmer going north. And yeah, that just has to do with our vocabulary being, developed in certain areas of the world, and those areas have certain circumstances, and so we have words that are cheats. They're not perfect definitions, they're not explicitly accurate. But clearly, as the world has gotten smaller, we're starting to change language. I mean, I think I've gotten people to be a little more careful about saying the word random, and I think certainly the word spontaneous, to most educated people, is a tricky word to play with. Even the whole idea of free will, that's just not thrown around on YouTube like oh yeah, sure, we have free will. I mean, that's been well argued to be a broken bit of vocabulary, especially that free part. Because it doesn't make any sense. Free from what? Intelligence? Yeah, that's a good will to have. Free from intelligence. Free from knowledge. Free from any hope of getting the right answer. What a great will that would be. Anyway. So you change the language and you figure out that, okay, maybe what we're saying is closer to the equator when we say the word south. And so then the people in the south could say, south was closer to the equator. So everybody could just orient to a different language, or we just come up with a different word and we just say, okay, instead of saying I'm going to go south, I want to say I'm going to head for the equator. But I mean, it's a fixable misdescription of reality. It's not some sort of paradox. It's not some sort of language is always broken. No, language gets fixed, just takes time. I think 100 years from now, the word love isn't, if there was to be 100 years from now, and as long as the Muslims don't kill everybody and take over the world, stupid words like love are going to be used a lot less, and people are going to have to be a little more descriptive about what they're talking about, because we're going to understand that these are just emotional trigger words that don't really have any meaning. They're undefined, and they define nothing as vacuous pieces of happy talk. It's baby talk, and language will grow up if we allow it to. If we allow people who have some respect for language to develop our language. Now, if we let the ghetto decide, we'll have 10 words, and we'll be assholes that can't say anything else but, hooker, slut, bitch. So anyway, yeah. So, but to pretend that you're this this individual who can't understand that, I think you clearly can understand that. I think you've been to enough places in the world to understand that words are a little bit arbitrary sometimes, and that they're just not well defined. And if you give them better definition, there will be no confusion about what's taking place. And reality hasn't changed at all. And it's not a matter of saying perception, it's just a matter of accurate communication. And so again, playing this game that you're going to change the truth of evolution by saying I'm going to look at it from some other point of view, frankly, you just can't do it. It shows you the same thing. The truth is the same. See, that's the thing with the truth. When you find a piece of truth, Doesn't matter which way you turn it. It's the same facets will always show their face. It's always the same thing. It doesn't change from some other perspective. There's no other perspective. It's the truth. It's what it is. Can't be misunderstood. Like I said, and only through language tricks can you hope to use words of perversion to change what you're happening. You can describe any event. I could describe a rectal exam in some sort of artistic language and make it sound like some sort of wonderful encounter with your loved one, or something like that. Playing with words and poetry and nonsense. Or I can accurately describe what's going to take place. Or I could even do it inaccurately in a negative way, in the sense I could make it sound much worse than it really is, by leaving out details of properly applied anesthesia or something like that. But anyway, so you can sit there and play word games and say, okay, I've successfully evaded reality by playing a word game. But that, frankly, I don't know. What's the argument that that's not exactly what you're doing? Pretending that we can't understand the truth because we can't properly describe it sometimes. Now, the two are very different. I'm just saying most of the facts that are in contention here that you're saying are not acceptable absolutes. In my opinion, they are acceptable absolutes. Now, you can say they don't exist. Again, if you're going to say evolution isn't the story, then just admit you're a theist, because there is no anything else. It's just, you either concede that it's just a byproduct of mechanical function, like Earth's going around suns. There's mechanical functions. Those mechanical functions take place in chemistry, and just as there could be complex solar systems, there can be little moons around planets and moons around the moons and all kinds of little shit going on, stuff moving all kinds of eccentric ways. There can be compounds in chemistry that grow into very monstrous collections of stuff held together by these atomic forces, and that can get to a point where it does this replicating thing, and then this replicating thing creates this opportunity for change, and then the change creates opportunity for competition, and then the competition creates what we have manifest in after 4 billion years on planet Earth, and that's our origin. Now, there's nothing, and I'm just saying, if you take the truth of evolution and apply it to an understanding of your psychology, then you'll understand that, yes, optimism bias is quite obvious. Yes, obviously we have this compulsive need. That's one of the trademark features of being a consciousness. It's the fact that it's born needing, wanting, desiring. That's what it does. And it doesn't do it for some good reason. It does it because it's this survival of a frickin' molecule. The dodo bird went extinct. It wasn't a huge tragedy. Most of the things that have lived on planet Earth no longer live, and nobody's sitting around lamenting some 6-foot dinosaur that went extinct 300 million years ago, and that it's not doing that unique thing that it was doing. So again, I'm just saying that I'm not asking you to concede some complete conclusion. I'm just saying that, yes, it's logically indicated, but for you to sit there and just evade this ominous truth sitting there right in front of you, this abyss truth, that the game you're playing is not productive, and in the real circumstance of there's real stakes here. Again, there's the living mechanism on planet Earth is killing many children to produce the succeeder's life is built out of the brutality of the unsuccessful. The disabled, the people who die early pay the bill for the people who live long and have a nice Social Security. That's the truth of it. It's a brutally unpleasant truth we live in. Losing has real consequence, and there's a certain obnoxiousness from the people who are sitting in the winner's chair, talking about how easy it was when they didn't have to have their skin burned off in World War II, and they didn't have to go through you know, 5 years of bone marrow transplants when they were 13. I just think it's just a, you know, there's a if you're gonna argue outside the context of the facts that can be gleaned about our existence, and you're going to say, I'm leaving it open. Leprechaun theory is possible. Fairy princesses, fairy godmothers. You're just going to keep opening, saying, I'm going to leave all these doors open to any imagined possibility. So anything if I just spend the next half hour imagining all kinds of crazy beasties. You know, I mean, South Park used like a hippopotamus as a representation of God, like a hippopotamus with 2 heads or some kind. You know, I mean, you just make up anything and just say that's the story of the reality. Is whatever my imagination can produce. Doesn't matter how many feet I put on it, how many toes it can have. You know, I can make it into anything, and therefore we can't be decisive because we can imagine some kind of fairy tale, and fairy tales win. And so we're going to suspend any obligation to pay any attention to what we do know, because we're just going to leave the door open to anything that can be imagined. And that's just, it's intellectually dishonest, I think, because I don't think a brain that can have any respect for truth would be willing to go there and open that door unless they're desperately trying to suppress the truth. Alright, so enough of that. And then Puro. Alright, so as I have pointed out in videos that he probably doesn't watch, you know, our argument is that you keep claiming premises, proofs, that I'm saying are not proofs of anything. And the biggest argument I'm going to make is that this subject, although I don't think it has that many moving parts, again, a unification theory is really just trying to unify the forces. Gravity, the photoelectric type spectrum, the electromagnetic spectrum, which includes light, and magnetism. You know, and the nuclear forces, I would argue, are sort of irrelevant because they're basically just magnetism on the close scale. You know, at the source of the magnetism. Anyway, you know, but I'm not excluding them from this thing, but that's what we're talking about as the general subject. That was the ambition of Einstein, and the ambition of physics basically is to find a solution to what appears to be a problem of contradictions between the big universe and the small universe and the middle universe. Things that are witnessed that don't fit into the diagrams, the models. For the model for the big universe doesn't match the model for the middle universe, doesn't match the model for the little universe. And the argument is it's all the same universe. The only real planets are the little ones, you know, inside the atom. You know, the idea is that it's not something all the way down. There is a down. There's a bottom. And a unification theory would be a confirmation of that. And so there's these simple elements. Again, just there's gravity, there's magnetism, there's radiation, you know, light, the relatives of light, or however you want to describe that. Like I said, I choke saying the words electromagnetic spectrum because I don't think there's anything electric or magnetic about the spectrum. That's what Maxwell did to the concept of this force. He turned the force into something magnetic because he made photons going the same speed as magnetism rather than magnetism going the same speed as photons. But anyway, all right, and so you have this subject, and I'm just saying the subject isn't that complicated, but it has to be taken a piece at a time, and it has to be taken an experiment, a relevant experiment at a time. And you know, your argument is always to do something like, okay, I demonstrate huge weaknesses in the two-slit experiment as proof of anything. Alright, so I think I can establish that it's weak proof. So it shouldn't be used as an argument. And then you'll say, well, what about this other experiment? And then this other experiment? And then this other experiment? And in a sense, my obligation essentially becomes debunk every single experiment. And some of these experiments are incredibly complex that have huge number of moving parts. Where the only advantage of the two-slit experiment is it's the oldest and simplest of these experiments, and is much easier to diagnose possibilities where they've miscalculated, where they've made wrong assumptions. And obviously these other experiments require you to go through the details of the instrument producing the presumptive photons and the presumptive mirrors and the presumptive this and the presumptive that, and all the assumptions are built into what they think they have in the sense of what they're comparing on their scales. And just as in the two-slit experiment, lots of assumptions went into that experiment, assumptions that were wrong, that this somehow has something to do with how many slits you have, or a photon going through two openings, when it has nothing to do with that, quite obviously, as the single slit proves. This has nothing to do with two openings. It has nothing to do with a photon splitting in half. I think that can be logically deduced and should be conceded by you, that this has nothing to do with photons having two identities. This has to do with somehow small material openings causing photons to do some kind of Huygens thing or some other kind of thing. So this really has nothing to do with any kind of interference, in the sense that the idea is that there has to be some mechanical thing that's creating the interference, some mechanical barrier that's causing the photon to have a duality problem or something. I'm just saying that's just logical. And so instead of doing what I think is the fair thing to do and concede that a lot of the assumptions of what is now called quantum mechanics, as I keep wanting to go back to Feynman and quantum electrodynamics, but what is defining quantum mechanics is a lot of wrong assumptions about what the two-slit experiment demonstrates, because in effect it demonstrates nothing. Okay, and the single slit experiment is where the paradoxical problem is created. That's the place we should be coming up with explanations, and the explanations again of Huygens, this completely unproven wavelet theory, should be recognized as kind of like me. Inventing invisible cats, creating problems in the world, like gremlins. It doesn't really answer why the thing broke. Saying gremlins did it is kind of bullshit, and I think somebody who takes science seriously should know that no one should be allowed in a serious science conversation to say the gremlins did it. And I'm arguing that that's essentially what you're doing when you keep trying to resurrect this zombie, archaic misrepresentation of truth. The fact that they made so much out of the two-slit experiment and completely ignored the single slit did exactly the same shit. Fundamentally the same shit, not exactly, fundamentally the same thing. And if I can't even get you to concede that, even when I play professors at MIT, saying words like they never should have used a different word, diffraction, for single slit interference. It's the same phenomenon. So no matter how many of those I have from Yale or Harvard or MIT or Stanford saying those words, that doesn't somehow mean something in the fact that, yeah, there's something fundamentally wrong with how this experiment is being represented and what is being represented to prove, and that it doesn't prove what they state it's proving. It doesn't close a door to anything or open door. It doesn't provide any real knowledge. And the real knowledge is going to come from understanding what happens in a single slit, if anything. And again, my argument is that I have provided a theory of mechanical explanation that does make it just a fraction, and that the consequence of moving protons and neutrons in closer and closer proximity to each other has a consequence, and that consequence is being realized in this quantum phenomenon. And that's why it's a quantum phenomenon. It's because you have to move protons and neutrons and electrons closer to each other. It can only happen when they're close to each other. That you can affect that field. That field only exists in that tiny part of the universe. It doesn't exist in any other part of the universe. And you can't duplicate the two-slit experiment in any real way with basketballs and, goalposts or something like that. Because, yes, even though it's still a quantum phenomenon in the sense that the basketball still has electrons and there's all these, they can still go very close to a surface and all that stuff. But yes, the influence is going to be infinitesimally small. Something's still picking at my house. It's always at night. Go away, bastard! Unwelcome critter! Shoe! Yeah. Shoe? What good is that? Glove! Yeah, maybe that'll work. Glove! It's one of those anaconda-bod things. Why do we say shoe? That seems rather arbitrary. I guess it's because people would throw a shoe, or, they would kick, or something. So, shoe became associated with go away. Or I shall put my shoe in your butthole. Alright, anyway. So this is a strangled way to say, it seems more tedious than it should be, that we have to narrow these conversations. And I just don't accept, he basically says superposition in the sense of particles being in two places at once has been proven. That you can't even have a disagreement anymore. You can't even, we won't even listen to your evidence. And it's just what's the fuck? It's just idiotic to tell me what you have proven in quantum mechanics, because I think every time these experiments are analyzed, they are found to be quite imperfect in terms of the assumptions built in. And I think it goes for gravitational waves. It goes for all this stuff. It's built on a huge number of weakly supported assumptions about how the universe functions. And so to say you have proven something, I think is bullshit. And I'm just saying that from my perspective, presenting an alternative explanation for the fundamental mechanics, to say that I have to now demonstrate how my mechanics applies to every single experiment conducted in the history of physics, because that's essentially what you're going to do. You're just going to say, well, what about these conclusions they drew from this experiment? And now I'm going to be obligated to go back to that experiment and point out every little flaw in it before I can say, no, this explains it better, and I don't need to bother with that experiment. If you want to play some sort of it's like, let's say I create an obstacle course, and I have 10 obstacles that the things have to run, and say it's a dog that it runs them. It doesn't matter, human doesn't, whatever. How I arrange those obstacles will change how fast the fastest will be able to run the obstacle course, because of muscle fatigue and just the differences of the transitions. The transitions will create a difference in the outcome just because of what advantages and disadvantages are created in those changes from one medium to the next medium, from one event to the next event. So obviously if you stacked a bunch of leg events on top of each other, the legs would get tired and blah blah blah, and you'd have a worse performance. Where if you had to use your legs, and then the next event you were crawling and using your arms, and the next event if you if you perfectly organize those events, those 10 events, there's a perfect arrangement where you have the fastest potential, and you have an arrangement that creates the slowest potential. And every experiment's going to have those kind of nuances in them. And again, if we just assume because it's the same 10, it's the same outcome, that's not being very scientific. And again, and I'm just saying that most of these things can be identified as weak evidence. I'm not saying you should say it's no evidence. I'm not saying when you look at those very fuzzy and crappy, logically crappy in terms of where the gravity is, lensing images, I'm not saying don't think it's not that evidence is absolute proof. Just concede that it's an indication that there might be lensing, but it's a long way from proof of something, because it does have problems. It's just not coherent to the expectation. Because if we conclude that it is lensing, then you have to explain why there's no lensing in places you know there's hard gravity. And then we get back into this whole diffraction argument. You have to be able to tell the difference between light that gets diffracted because it's going close to the surface of something, like I'm certain the atmosphere around the sun will diffract light. That's not lensing, that's diffraction. The light is hitting the electrons or the atoms of the material around the sun, the densely packed material of the atmosphere of the sun in terms of the high energy atmosphere. And just like light gets fucked up by the atmosphere when it's moving a lot because of heat radiation. There's distortion. That's diffraction. That's not lensing. How can they tell the difference between those two things on these tiny margins? It's really hard to tell the difference between those two things on these tiny margins. And for your unwillingness to concede that, okay, well, maybe that's just not. And I don't even consider that an important part of this thing. I'm just saying it's only relevant in the sense that there have been a lot of conclusions drawn about how the universe works based on weak evidence. All right, maybe we could more successfully argue if we have a limitation on how many experiments I'm obligated to debunk, and how complex those experiments are, because, yes, frankly, I'm not going to be able to in any way test the instruments myself, so it just depends on how much what faith you have in the conclusions drawn of the people doing the experiment sometimes. But anyway, the general subject, I'm just saying I can argue generally for I can debunk the debunk of Feynman about particle gravity. I can explain why his analogy of raindrops is inappropriate in a kinetic ball bearing style universe. Raindrop arguments don't work anymore when everything's moving the speed of light, when all the things that make up the universe, when all the sand is all the same sand. All of a sudden this friction argument gets a little more complicated. And then time, I can say, look, this whole, we turned it into a dimension for one reason, right? Because of time dilation. And the idea of relativity, that somehow when things are moving, they have relative space they exist in. And the real argument is no, they're just physically broken. They're physically different. So that goes to the whole argument of inertia. Physics doesn't have an explanation of inertia. It just says things that are moving keep moving, but it doesn't explain how they keep moving. How do the little protons and electrons and neutrons actually go from one place to another place? By what force? And momentum isn't a force. Not explained anyway by physics. And I'm just saying I can give you an explanation. I can explain to you how the force is moving the speed of light, and depending on how much of the force is moving in a particular direction, the thing will move in that direction. I can use a school of fish analogy or metaphor and explain what inertia is. But we got to narrow to these subjects, and I can explain magnetism by explaining polarization, and then I can, and I can explain the radiation that we call light, or the electromagnetic spectrum, as just being the same force at frequency, the same force that causes gravity, except it's polarized and at a specific frequency. So I'm just saying, but I can't. If your argument is that I always have to go back to disproving Heisenberg, which I don't think was ever proven. If you're saying that's the truth, and I have to disprove your truth that photons don't have a position, well, I'm not going to be able to do it with this theory. I'm not going to be able to do it with this explanation. This explanation doesn't account for things that don't exist, quite obviously. And so you're arguing that there is this thing where something can be in two places at once. I'm saying there's no reason for my physics to account for that because it doesn't exist. There's no reason for me. There would be no logic in my in understanding. There's no necessary mechanism here. I don't need to make things go in two places at once, except to satisfy nuanced experiments full of assumptions, like the two-slit experiment or something wrongly assumed, where matter is taken out of the equation and we just assume photons are seeing material things in their way, and they're being affected by material things in their way, and that the photons have some sort of choice to do something. When my argument is no, the material things are the complex things, the electrons, the protons, and the neutrons, and that's the world the photon is navigating. It's not. It doesn't have any options. It's being affected by the matter. The energy isn't affecting, making decisions. The matter's causing the effect. And I'm saying that's perfectly consistent with what Feynman was saying back in the early 70s when he pointed out that photons basically go from point A to point B in a straight line. And it's when they hit an electron that something interesting happens. All right, I don't want to beat it to death. But yeah, there's no room for this argument if I have to argue with what you state to be absolutely proven, because I don't think any of this crap has been absolutely proven. And I'm not going to endlessly chase after endlessly complex experiments to demonstrate why I have a viable counter explanation than Heisenberg or Huygens or bent space or dilated time. I can explain the phenomenon without having to use any of those mechanisms. I can explain it as a mechanical system. And what you need to do is explain what experiment demonstrates that's not possible. You say something's been debunked. You say something's been proven. You haven't proven any of these elements to be impossible explanations. So until you do, I'm calling bullshit on your method of conversation. You say you're a skeptic, but it doesn't seem like you have any skepticism for your icons and for the babble of your priests of quantum mechanics. And I'm saying a little bit of skepticism makes it quite possible to see there's lots of counter arguments and lots of ways to recognize that they have so skewed vision. Just this whole idea that they've taken the matter out of any of these experiments. They treat like the reflection in a mirror. They treat it as if, it's a given that the photon is reflecting and actually bouncing off of the mirror, when there's every kind of evidence that the photon's getting absorbed and readmitted by the mirror. And there's certainly evidence that the photon is being substantially interfered with, even going through the glass covering the mirror. That it's, traveling a less than straight line to do that. All right. Yeah, I don't, no point in beating it to death, but I just don't think you've made a single viable counter argument to a single argument I have made about this alternative explanation. You just keep telling me we have a proof, so we don't need a better explanation. And I don't think you have proven any of this. Anyway, enough of a video, I think. Let me just make sure. I mean, yeah, so, you know, some skeptic. Yeah, just silly things where, you know, I mean, I made an obvious reference, a joke about when he uses the word concrete to describe the strength of an evidence or a conclusion. And yeah, I just made a joke, Piro. I understand use of the word concrete. My whole point is that what physics is called concrete assumptions are not very concrete. Yeah, they're very weak sand. Anyway, so yeah, no point in going through the whole thing. But anyway, yeah. So, but like I said, I just don't think there's a. I think your. I don't think there's any difference between this and the philosophical problem. You're really glued to some kind of thing. You have, like I said, you have an underlying philosophical perception of the universe, and anything that's in conflict with that, you will endlessly, in my opinion, attempt to rationalize excuses to not accept that fact, because that fact is in contradiction with what you have glued yourself to as a where it's all going to end. And if I point out that there's something going in the opposite direction, you know that you can't get there from there. So you're just going to keep pretending the there doesn't have any substance or meaning. And yeah, I think it looks kind of like desperate rationalizations from my perspective. No less desperate than Anacondavod's. Until next time and such.